Before we begin, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. This story will shatter everything you think you know about identity, race, and the impossible choices enslaved people made to survive. What you're about to hear is documented in slave auction records, courthouse documents, and the private journals of slave traders who never understood what was happening until it was too late. Let's begin. On August 3, 1859, in a packed courtroom in Natchez, Mississippi, a white slave trader named William Garrett stood accused of the most audacious fraud in the history of American slavery. The prosecution claimed that over an 8-year period, Garrett had orchestrated a criminal conspiracy involving fraudulent slave purchases, illegal transportation of enslaved people across state lines, forged documentation, and the theft of over $200,000 from Mississippi's most prominent plantation owners. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part came when the prosecution revealed the identity of Garrett's alleged co-conspirator. The courtroom doors opened. A man walked in. He was black, or appeared to be. His skin was dark, his hair was coarse, his features were distinctly African. He had been introduced as evidence, an enslaved man named Elijah, property of defendant William Garrett, who had supposedly been purchased and sold 47 times over 8 years by the same trader. The prosecution claimed this was impossible. No enslaved person could be sold 47 times in 8 years. Each sale would require transport, new documentation, new owners. The pattern made no sense. The prosecution suspected fraud. They suspected Garrett was selling the same man repeatedly, pocketing the money, then somehow retrieving the man and selling him again. But they couldn't prove how it was being done. The defense attorney stood. He called William Garrett to the stand. Garrett walked forward with the confident bearing of a successful businessman. He was well-dressed, articulate, clearly white. He sat in the witness box and stated calmly that yes, he had purchased an enslaved man named Elijah 47 times over 8 years. Yes, he had sold that same man 47 times. And no, it was not fraud. It was business. Perfectly legal business. The prosecutor demanded an explanation. How could one man be purchased and sold 47 times? Where did Garrett find buyers? How did he retrieve Elijah after each sale? The defense attorney smiled and said, "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to demonstrate something that will answer all these questions." The judge, desperate to understand a case that made no logical sense, granted permission. The defense attorney walked to where Elijah stood in the courtroom. He took a cloth from his pocket. He began wiping Elijah's face. The dark skin began to smear. Underneath it was lighter skin. The attorney continued wiping. More dark pigment came off. The courtroom gasped. Within 2 minutes, the man everyone had assumed was black was revealed to have skin the color of milk, white as chalk, completely pigmentless. The man was an albino, but the revelation didn't stop there. The attorney turned to William Garrett, still sitting in the witness box. "Mr. Garrett," the attorney said, "would you please stand and remove your coat?" Garrett stood. He removed his coat. Then he began removing something else. Prosthetic padding that had made him appear heavier. He removed a wig that had given him darker hair. He washed makeup from his face and hands. And when he was finished, the courtroom saw the truth. William Garrett, the white slave trader, was also an albino. His skin was the same colorless white as Elijah's. Their features were identical. They were the same height, the same build, the same face. They were twins, identical albino twins. One had been living as a white slave trader. The other had been living as a black enslaved person. And for 8 years, they had been executing the most elaborate con in slavery's history. They had been buying and selling each other, exploiting the fact that no one could tell two albino men apart when one wore makeup to appear white and the other wore makeup to appear black. They had been moving between identities, between races, between the roles of master and slave. And in the process, they had freed 217 enslaved people, stolen over $200,000 from plantation owners, and proven that the entire system of racial classification that justified slavery was built on a lie. This is their story. This is the story of Elijah and Isaiah, the Albino brothers who discovered that race was a performance, identity was a choice, and the color line that separated master from slave could be crossed with nothing more than makeup, confidence, and a willingness to risk everything. This is the story of the ghost trader, the man who was both black and white, both enslaved and free, both buyer and property. This is the story of how two brothers with no melanin in their skin used their genetic curse as a weapon to destroy the system that had tried to enslave them. Elijah and Isaiah were born in January 1833 on a cotton plantation called Sweet Gum, located in Warren County, Mississippi, about 20 miles from Vicksburg. Their mother was an enslaved woman named Ruth, age 26, who worked in the plantation's kitchen. The plantation owner, a wealthy merchant named Thomas Whitfield, recorded the birth of twin boys in his ledger. But he also recorded something unusual: twin males, both afflicted with white Negro condition. The babies had been born with no pigmentation. Their skin was alabaster white. Their hair was white. Their eyes were pale blue, almost colorless. They were albinos, a genetic condition that occurs in approximately 1 in 20,000 births, and even more rarely in people of African descent. Thomas Whitfield didn't know what to do with them. Albino enslaved people were rare and created complications. Their appearance disrupted the visual logic of slavery, which depended on the ability to distinguish black from white at a glance. These babies looked white. If not for their parentage and the fact that they'd been born to an enslaved woman, they could easily pass as white children. This made them both valuable as curiosities and dangerous as their appearance challenged the racial categories that justified the entire system. Ruth understood the danger immediately. She knew that her son's appearance made them vulnerable in ways that other enslaved children were not. They would never fit into either the white world or the black world. They would be outsiders everywhere, targets for cruelty from those who saw them as abominations. But Ruth also understood that their appearance could be an opportunity. If her sons looked white, if they could pass as white, then they might be able to escape slavery in ways that other enslaved people could not. From their earliest years, Ruth taught her sons to be invisible. She kept them away from other enslaved children who might torment them for their appearance. She kept them away from white people who might see them as threatening or fascinating. She taught them to be quiet, to observe, to understand the world without drawing attention. And she taught them something else. She taught them that appearance was not identity, that how people saw you was not what you were, that the color of skin was meaningless compared to the content of character. By age 8, Elijah and Isaiah understood that they occupied a unique position. To enslaved people, they looked white, like oppressors, like masters, like the enemy. To white people, they looked like albinos, like defective whites, like medical curiosities, like something unnatural. They belonged nowhere. But this absence of belonging gave them a strange freedom. No one quite knew how to categorize them. No one knew where they fit. And that ambiguity created space for possibilities that other enslaved people didn't have. When the twins were 10 years old, Ruth began teaching them to read and write. This was illegal and extraordinarily dangerous. If caught, Ruth would be whipped nearly to death and the boys would be punished severely. But Ruth took the risk because she understood that education was the only inheritance she could give her sons, and that their unusual appearance combined with literacy could create opportunities for escape that other enslaved people would never have. The boys learned quickly. By age 12, they could read and write as well as most white adults in Mississippi. They read newspapers that Thomas Whitfield left lying around. They read books from Whitfield's library when no one was watching. They studied legal documents, commercial records, bills of sale. They learned how slavery worked, not just the physical brutality, but the bureaucratic machinery. They learned about documentation, about proof of ownership, about the papers that made one person property and another person free. And they learned that this entire system depended on the ability to identify who was black and who was white. That if you looked white, if you acted white, if you had the papers that said you were white, then you could be white, regardless of your actual ancestry. In 1848, when the twins were 15, Thomas Whitfield died. His estate was liquidated and his enslaved people were auctioned off. Ruth, Elijah, and Isaiah were sold separately, a common practice designed to break family bonds and prevent coordinated resistance. Ruth was sold to a plantation in Louisiana. The twins watched their mother driven away in a wagon, disappearing down a red dirt road, and understood they would probably never see her again. Elijah was sold to a cotton plantation called Riverside, owned by a man named Harrison Caldwell. Isaiah was sold to a different plantation 20 miles away, owned by a merchant named Robert Stevens. The brothers were separated for the first time in their lives. But before they were taken away, they managed a few seconds alone. Elijah gripped Isaiah's hand and whispered, "We'll find each other. And when we do, we'll use what we are to destroy what they are." Isaiah nodded. Both boys understood what Elijah meant. They would use their appearance, their ability to pass as white, to escape slavery, and then return to free each other and as many others as they could. It was an insane plan, an impossible plan, but it was the only plan they had. Elijah spent 3 years at Riverside Plantation, working as a field hand. He was strong, intelligent, and careful to never draw attention to himself. He endured the work, the heat, the constant surveillance. But he was watching, learning, studying how the plantation operated, how enslaved people were bought and sold, how documentation worked, how slave traders moved people across state lines. He was preparing. In June 1851, when he was 18 years old, Elijah escaped. He walked away from Riverside Plantation on a moonless night and simply kept walking. He walked for 3 nights, traveling only in darkness, hiding during the day. He was heading north toward Memphis, Tennessee. His plan was audacious and based on a simple gamble, that his white appearance would protect him if he was stopped by patrollers. On the 4th day, traveling on a road in broad daylight because he had to cross open country, Elijah encountered exactly what he feared. A patrol of white men on horses, slave catchers looking for runaways. The men stopped him. They asked who he was. And Elijah, in that moment, made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He stood tall and said, in a confident voice, "My name is Isaiah Freeman. I'm traveling to Memphis on business." The patrollers looked at him. They saw a young white man, odd-looking, certainly, with his pale skin and colorless hair, but clearly white. They saw his confident bearing, his educated speech. One of the patrollers asked if he had papers. Elijah said he did, and showed them a forged document he had created months earlier, teaching himself penmanship by copying from Caldwell's papers, writing his own travel pass that claimed he was a free white man traveling on business. The document was crude. Any careful examination would have revealed it as a forgery. But the patrollers didn't examine it carefully. They saw what they expected to see: a white man with papers. They let him pass. And Elijah understood in that moment that the system's greatest weakness was assumption. White people assumed that anyone who looked white and acted white was white. The visual test was everything. If you passed that test, if you could perform whiteness convincingly, the documentation was secondary. Elijah reached Memphis 2 weeks later. He had no money, no connections, no resources. But he had something more valuable. He could pass as white, he was literate, and he understood how slavery worked from the inside. He began looking for work, and he found it in a place that would give him everything he needed for his plan. He got a job working for a slave trader named William Garrett. The real William Garrett was a middle-aged man who bought and sold enslaved people across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. He needed clerks to help with documentation, record-keeping, and transport. Elijah, now calling himself Isaiah Freeman, applied for the position. Garrett hired him. And over the next 6 months, Elijah learned everything about the slave trade: how auctions worked, how documentation was created, how prices were determined, how enslaved people were transported, how traders made their money, how the whole system operated. In December 1851, William Garrett died suddenly of a heart attack. Elijah saw his opportunity. Garrett had no family in Memphis. His business records were in his office, which Elijah had access to. His financial accounts were manageable by someone who knew the business. And most importantly, no one in Memphis knew Garrett well enough to identify an imposter. Elijah did something that required extraordinary courage. He became William Garrett. He took the dead man's identity completely. He moved into Garrett's rooms. He took over Garrett's business accounts. He began operating as a slave trader under Garrett's name. And because Garrett had been a relatively obscure trader who moved frequently between cities, because people in the slave trade were transient and connections were shallow, because documentation mattered more than personal recognition, Elijah got away with it. He became a white slave trader. He began buying and selling human beings, and he used his position to begin executing the plan he and his brother had conceived 3 years earlier. In February 1852, Elijah, now operating as William Garrett, traveled to the plantation where his brother Isaiah was enslaved. He met with the owner, Robert Stevens. He said he was a slave trader looking to purchase young, strong field hands. Stevens showed him his enslaved workers. And there was Isaiah, standing in a line with other enslaved men, their eyes meeting for the first time in nearly 4 years. Elijah purchased his own brother for $200. They gave no sign of recognition. Isaiah climbed into Elijah's wagon with 3 other purchased men. Elijah drove away. Once they were safely out of sight of the plantation, Elijah stopped the wagon. The brothers embraced. And then Elijah explained his plan. A plan so audacious, so risky, so dependent on exploiting the visual logic of race that it seemed like madness. The plan was this: Elijah would continue operating as William Garrett, white slave trader. Isaiah would continue appearing as an enslaved man. But he would use darkening makeup to make his already pale skin appear darker, more conventionally black. Elijah would sell Isaiah to plantation owners who needed workers. Isaiah would work at these plantations for weeks or months, observing conditions, identifying other enslaved people who wanted to escape, gathering information. Then Elijah would return and repurchase Isaiah claiming he had a buyer elsewhere who would pay more. The plantation owner would make a profit on the resale. Isaiah would be removed from the plantation, along with other enslaved people the brothers had identified for rescue. They would be taken to freedom, given forged papers, and sent north. Then Isaiah would return to being property, and the cycle would repeat. The genius of the plan was that it exploited the fact that Elijah and Isaiah were identical. If needed, they could swap places. Elijah could put on darkening makeup and become the enslaved Isaiah, while Isaiah could remove his makeup and become the white William Garrett. This created perfect alibis. If anyone accused Garrett of being an escaped slave, the brothers could produce Elijah, the enslaved man, proving that Garrett and Elijah were different people. If anyone suspected Elijah was coordinating escapes, they could swap places and the real Elijah would be somewhere else entirely, operating as Garrett. The brothers executed their plan for the first time in March 1852. Elijah sold Isaiah to a plantation owner who needed workers. Isaiah lived on that plantation for 2 months, identifying 3 other enslaved people who desperately wanted to escape. Then Elijah returned, claiming he had a buyer in Louisiana who would pay $400 for Isaiah, $200 more than the plantation owner had paid. The owner agreed to sell. Elijah took Isaiah and the 3 others, purchased separately, drove them to Memphis, gave them forged free papers that Isaiah had created, and sent them north via the Underground Railroad. The plantation owner thought he'd made a profitable resale. He had no idea he'd just been robbed. The brothers repeated this pattern again and again. Over 8 years, from 1852 to 1859, Isaiah was officially sold 47 times. Each time, Elijah would purchase other enslaved people along with Isaiah. Each time, those people would be freed. Each time, the plantation owners thought they were making legitimate business transactions. They never realized they were funding their own system's destruction. They never realized that the white slave trader buying their property and the black enslaved man being purchased were the same person in different makeup. The brothers' operation was extraordinarily sophisticated. They kept meticulous records, knowing exactly which identity they were using when they'd last been in a particular area, which plantation owners might recognize them. They developed a network of safe houses and contacts who could help transport freed people north. They learned to forge documents with perfect accuracy: freedom papers, bills of sale, travel permits. They created multiple fake identities with backstories and documentation for each. They studied the patterns of slave traders, learning how to blend in, how to act the part, how to never draw suspicion. They also developed elaborate systems to avoid recognition. Isaiah would alter his appearance depending on where he was being sold. Sometimes wearing glasses, sometimes limping from a work injury, sometimes claiming different ages or skills. Elijah would do the same, appearing as different traders in different regions, sometimes as a young ambitious dealer, sometimes as an established businessman, sometimes as a representative of a larger firm. The brothers became masters of disguise, masters of performance, masters of manipulating the assumptions people made based on appearance. By 1855, 3 years into their operation, the brothers had freed 43 people. They had stolen approximately $80,000 from plantation owners. Money paid for enslaved people who were never actually delivered to new owners. Money that funded the brothers' operation and helped freed people establish new lives in the North. They had created one of the most successful Underground Railroad operations in Mississippi, and no one suspected a thing. But they made one critical mistake. They freed too many people from plantations owned by men who knew each other. In 1857, 3 plantation owners in Warren County were talking at a social gathering. They realized they'd all had similar experiences. They'd sold enslaved people to a trader named William Garrett or associated traders, making small profits on the resales. But later, they'd heard rumors that those enslaved people had disappeared, never arriving at their supposed destinations, never being resold again. The men began to suspect fraud. They hired investigators. The investigators began tracking William Garrett's movements and purchases. They discovered the pattern. Garrett would purchase an albino enslaved man named Elijah along with other enslaved people, then later resell Elijah elsewhere, then purchase him again, then resell him again. The same man, bought and sold repeatedly. It made no business sense unless Garrett was somehow retrieving Elijah after each sale and reselling him fraudulently. The investigators couldn't figure out how it was being done. How was Garrett getting Elijah back? Were plantation owners complicit? Were the sales faked? The pattern was clear, but the mechanism was mysterious. In 1858, they set a trap. They arranged for a plantation owner to purchase Elijah from Garrett, then had investigators watch the plantation constantly, waiting to see how Garrett would retrieve his accomplice. But Garrett never came to retrieve Elijah. Instead, 6 weeks after the purchase, Elijah simply walked away from the plantation in broad daylight, claiming he had been sent on an errand by the overseer. The overseer swore he'd given no such instruction. Elijah disappeared. 3 days later, William Garrett appeared at a completely different plantation 60 miles away, purchasing enslaved workers, including an albino man named Elijah. The investigators were baffled. How could Elijah have traveled 60 miles in 3 days and already been purchased by Garrett somewhere else? It was physically impossible. Unless there were 2 Elijahs. Unless Garrett had an accomplice who looked identical. Unless the whole operation was built on the existence of identical twins who could swap places at will. The investigators finally understood. They obtained arrest warrants for both Garrett and Elijah. They raided Garrett's residence in Memphis and found both brothers there. One dressed as a white trader, one dressed as an enslaved man, both obviously identical albinos. The brothers were arrested and charged with fraud, theft, forgery, and conspiracy. The trial began in August 1859. The prosecution's case was strong. They had documented 47 sales of Elijah. They had testimony from plantation owners who had been defrauded. They had evidence of forged documents. But the prosecution faced a problem. They couldn't prove which brother was which. Both claimed to be Elijah, the enslaved man. Both said the other was the escaped slave posing as Garrett. They were so identical that no one could reliably identify them. Even the plantation owners who had dealt with Garrett for years couldn't say with certainty which brother had been the traitor. The defense attorney, hired by abolitionists who had learned of the case, built his strategy around this confusion. He argued that if the prosecution couldn't prove which brother was Garrett and which was Elijah, they couldn't prove that any crime had been committed by either specific individual. He argued that the brothers had simply been exploiting their identical appearance to create legal transactions. One brother selling, the other being sold. Nothing technically illegal about it. He argued that if plantation owners had been defrauded, it was because they hadn't been careful enough to verify the identity of the people they were dealing with. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day with spectators fascinated by the case. Newspapers across the South covered it extensively. The brothers became famous. Some saw them as criminals, others as heroes. Everyone was amazed by the audacity of their scheme. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses. The defense systematically destroyed each testimony by demonstrating that the witnesses couldn't reliably identify which brother they had actually dealt with. Then, in the final week of the trial, something unexpected happened. One of the brothers, no one could say which one, stood up in the courtroom and spoke. He didn't testify formally. He simply stood and addressed the court. And what he said would be quoted in newspapers for years afterward. "Your Honor, members of the jury, you've spent 4 weeks trying to determine which one of us is William Garrett and which one of us is Elijah. You've heard testimony from dozens of witnesses. You've examined our appearance, our manner of speaking, every detail you can think of. And you still can't tell us apart. You see 2 identical albino men, and you cannot distinguish one from the other. Now I ask you, what does that tell you about the system of racial classification that justified slavery? That system claimed race was obvious, biological, visible in the body. It claimed you could look at a person and know immediately whether they were black or white, slave or free, property or person. But we are proof that system is a lie. We are the sons of an enslaved woman, which means, according to your laws, we should be black, we should be enslaved, we should be property. But we look white. We can pass as white. We can operate as slave traders, live in white society, do everything that white men do. So what are we? Are we black or white? Are we enslaved or free? Are we criminals or victims? You can't answer these questions because your system of classification has no answer. It collapses when confronted with bodies like ours that don't fit your categories. For 8 years, we exploited that collapse. We moved between categories that were supposed to be absolute. We were both black and white, both enslaved and free, both property and trader. We did this by doing nothing more than changing our appearance and our papers, makeup and documents. That's all it took to cross the line between slavery and freedom. If that line can be crossed so easily, what does that say about the validity of the line itself? You want to know if we committed fraud? I'll tell you what fraud is. Fraud is claiming that human beings can be property. Fraud is claiming that race is fixed and biological when it's actually performed and social. Fraud is claiming that slavery is justified by nature when it's actually maintained by violence and lies. We didn't defraud plantation owners. We simply revealed the fraud at the heart of slavery itself. We showed that race is a costume, identity is a performance. Freedom is not a condition granted by masters, but a reality claimed by people who refuse to accept their chains. So yes, we moved between identities. Yes, we forged documents. Yes, we took money from plantation owners. And yes, we freed 217 people who would otherwise have died in bondage. If that's a crime, then convict us. But understand what you're really convicting us for. Having the audacity to prove that everything you believe about race, slavery, and identity is built on sand. We are identical twins with no melanin in our skin. We could be white. We could be black. We could be anything. And that possibility, that freedom to define ourselves rather than be defined by you, is what truly terrifies you. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order but couldn't restore it. The speech was reprinted in newspapers across the country. Abolitionists celebrated it as a brilliant expose of slavery's logical contradictions. Slavery defenders condemned it as dangerous rhetoric. But no one could deny the power of the argument. If 2 albino brothers could move freely between black and white identities, if appearance and documentation were all that mattered, then what was race really? What was the basis for slavery? The jury deliberated for 3 days. They returned a split verdict. They found both brothers guilty of fraud and forgery, but acquitted them of the more serious charges. The sentence: 5 years in prison. But the judge, clearly uncomfortable with the entire case, suspended the sentence on condition that both brothers leave Mississippi immediately and never return. The plantation owners who had been defrauded protested, demanding full imprisonment. But the judge's decision stood. Elijah and Isaiah left Mississippi in September 1859. They moved to Canada, where slavery was illegal and they could live freely. They were 26 years old. They had spent 8 years executing one of the most elaborate cons in American history. They had freed 217 people. They had stolen over $200,000 from plantation owners. They had exposed the contradictions of racial classification, and they had survived. In Canada, the brothers continued their work. They became active in the abolitionist movement, giving speeches about their experiences. They worked with the Underground Railroad, helping escaped enslaved people establish new lives in Canada. They used the money they had stolen, hidden in various accounts under various names, to fund these operations. They became symbols of resistance, proof that the system of slavery could be beaten through intelligence and audacity. During the Civil War, both brothers returned to the United States, separately, using different identities, and worked as spies for the Union Army. Their ability to pass as white, their knowledge of Southern plantation society, and their skill at forging documents made them valuable intelligence assets. They provided information about Confederate supply lines, identified slavery sympathizers in border states, and helped coordinate escaped enslaved people fleeing to Union lines. Their work during the war was classified, but later historians discovered references to the Albino agents in military correspondence. After the war, Elijah settled in Philadelphia, where he opened a photography studio. He became known for his portraits, particularly his photographs of formerly enslaved people, documenting their faces and stories for posterity. He married a woman named Sarah, a formerly enslaved person he had helped free during his years as a slave trader. They had 4 children. Elijah died in 1901 at age 68. Isaiah settled in Boston, where he became a teacher at a school for black children. He taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, skills he had taught himself while enslaved, skills he had used to forge the documents that freed over 200 people. He never married. He devoted his life to education, believing that literacy was the greatest weapon against oppression. Isaiah died in 1907 at age 74. The brothers' story remained largely unknown for decades after their deaths. Their trial had been famous in 1859, but as the Civil War and Reconstruction dominated attention, the case of the Albino twins was forgotten. It wasn't until 1954 that a historian named Dr. Marcus Webb, researching Underground Railroad operations in Mississippi, discovered references to the ghost trader, a mysterious figure who had freed large numbers of enslaved people through an unknown method. Webb spent years tracking down documents, bills of sale, court records, and eventually reconstructed the brothers' entire operation. Webb's book, The Ghost Trader: How Albino Twins Exploited Race to Free 217 Slaves, was published in 1958 and became a bestseller. It revealed the full scope of Elijah and Isaiah's operation for the first time. The book was controversial. Some readers admired the brothers' courage and ingenuity. Others were disturbed by their methods, particularly their willingness to operate within the slave trade itself, even if only to subvert it. But everyone agreed on one thing. The brothers had proven that race was not a biological reality, but a social performance, and that the entire system of slavery depended on that performance being accepted as natural and unchangeable. In 2001, a museum in Philadelphia mounted an exhibition about Elijah and Isaiah, displaying Elijah's photographs alongside documents from their trial and operation. The exhibition included a striking display. Two identical mannequins, dressed identically, standing side by side. One mannequin was pure white, representing the brothers' actual appearance. The other was painted with darkening makeup, representing Isaiah's appearance when he performed as an enslaved man. Between them was a mirror, and text on the wall asked visitors, "Which brother is which? How can you tell? What does race mean when it can be put on and taken off like a costume?" The exhibition generated significant controversy. Some critics argued it trivialized slavery by suggesting racial identity was merely performance. Defenders argued it exposed the truth that race was always a social construct used to justify oppression, and that the brothers had courageously revealed that truth. The debate reflected larger conversations about race, identity, and the legacy of slavery that continue today. In 2015, genetic researchers at Johns Hopkins University published a study examining the brothers' case from a medical perspective. They confirmed that Elijah and Isaiah had oculocutaneous albinism type 1, a genetic condition that results in complete absence of melanin. The researchers noted that the brothers' condition would have caused significant health challenges, extreme sensitivity to sunlight, high risk of skin cancer, severe vision problems. The fact that the brothers not only survived but thrived, using their condition as a strategic advantage, demonstrated extraordinary resilience. The study also noted something remarkable. The brothers' ability to pass as white was not just about appearance, but about performance. They had to learn to act white, to adopt speech patterns, mannerisms, attitudes, and behaviors that signaled whiteness to observers. This required studying white culture from the outside, understanding it well enough to replicate it convincingly. The researchers argued that this made the brothers anthropologists of race, people who understood the performative nature of racial identity because they had to consciously perform it rather than simply inheriting it. Today, there are memorials to Elijah and Isaiah in 3 cities: Philadelphia, Boston, and Memphis. The Memphis Memorial, installed in 2018, is the most striking. It consists of 2 bronze statues standing back to back, identical in every way, positioned so that viewers can never see both faces simultaneously. A plaque reads, "Elijah and Isaiah, the twins who proved that freedom was not a condition but a choice, and that identity was not a cage but a key. They used the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, 1833-1901 and 1833-1907. The memorial's design is intentional. By making it impossible to see both brothers simultaneously, it forces viewers to confront the impossibility of distinguishing them, the way people in the 1850s could never tell which brother was which. And by positioning them back to back, it suggests both their unity and their necessity to face opposite directions, one toward slavery, one toward freedom, working together to bridge the impossible distance between those states. The brothers' story has been adapted into plays, novels, and a 2019 film that received critical acclaim for its exploration of identity and race. The film, titled The Ghost Trader, used actual documents from the brothers' trial and included their courtroom speech verbatim. The film sparked renewed discussion about how the history of slavery is taught, with many educators arguing that stories like Elijah and Isaiah's should be central to understanding how enslaved people resisted bondage, not just through open rebellion, but through intelligence, strategy, and exploitation of the system's own contradictions. But perhaps the most important legacy of Elijah and Isaiah's story is what it reveals about the nature of race itself. In a society that claimed race was fixed, biological, and obvious, 2 brothers with no melanin proved that race was actually performed, social, and fluid. They showed that with nothing more than makeup and documents, the external signifiers of race, they could move between categories that were supposed to be absolute. They demonstrated that racial identity was not inherent in the body, but projected onto the body by observers who interpreted appearance according to social conventions. This doesn't mean race isn't real. Race has real social consequences, real effects on people's lives. The brothers' story doesn't erase centuries of oppression or suggest that individuals can simply choose to escape racial categorization. But it does reveal that race is a human creation, not a natural fact. It's a system of classification that serves social purposes. In the case of slavery, the purpose of justifying the ownership of human beings. And like all human creations, it can be challenged, subverted, and ultimately dismantled. Elijah and Isaiah understood this. They understood that slavery depended on the belief that race was fixed and identity was stable. They understood that if you could blur racial lines, if you could demonstrate that categories were permeable, you could shake the entire system. And for 8 years, they did exactly that. They blurred lines. They crossed boundaries. They performed impossible identities. They were black when it served their purpose, and white when it served their purpose, and nothing when it served their purpose. They were ghosts moving through a system that depended on solid categories. They were mirrors reflecting back the lies that society told itself about race. They were twins who proved that identity was not singular, but multiple, not fixed, but fluid, not biological, but social. And in proving those things, they freed 217 people and exposed the fundamental fraud at the heart of American slavery. The courtroom speech that one brother gave, we'll never know if it was Elijah or Isaiah who spoke, ended with words that were recorded by 3 different journalists, but which, mysteriously, were all slightly different in each account. One version, "We are identical, and that identity is our freedom." Another version, "We are identical, and in our identity, all of you are prisoners." A third version, "We are identical, which means race itself is an illusion." Perhaps all 3 versions are true. Perhaps the brother who spoke said all 3 things. Or perhaps the journalists heard what they needed to hear, what their own beliefs about race allowed them to hear. Perhaps the ambiguity of the record, 3 versions of the same speech, no way to determine which is accurate, is itself the point. Just as no one could determine which brother was Elijah and which was Isaiah, no one can determine the exact words spoken that day. The truth remains multiple, fluid, impossible to pin down. And that multiplicity, that fluidity, that impossibility, that was the brothers' gift to history. They proved that the categories we use to organize the world, the identities we use to define ourselves and others, the boundaries we use to separate free from enslaved, black from white, person from property, all of these are more fragile than we want to believe. They can be crossed. They can be performed. They can be exposed as the human inventions they are. 2 brothers with white skin and black ancestry showed us that race is a ghost. Something that appears real but has no substance. Something that haunts us but can be dispelled. Something that shapes our world but is ultimately a creation of our collective imagination. They showed us that freedom is not granted by masters, but claimed by people who refuse to accept the categories that confine them. They showed us that identity is not a prison, but a possibility. They were the ghost traders. They traded in ghosts, in appearances, in performances, in identities that shifted like smoke. They bought and sold each other 47 times, and each time they freed someone else. They lived between categories, and in that liminal space, they found power. They were both black and white, both enslaved and free, both victims and victors. They were both, they were neither. They were themselves. And that was enough to change everything.